Good morning and welcome to Behavioural Research UK, our webinar series. The theme today is open science and the importance of pre-registration. Next slide. My name is Dr. Sharon Cox and I am BR UK's Deputy Director, and I'm also a Principal Research Fellow in Behavioural Science and Health at UCL. Today I will be presenting alongside two colleagues. The first, Professor Marcus Munafo. He is a Professor of Biological Psychology and an MRC investigator from the University of Bristol. And those who have keenly followed the open science movement will know that Marcus has played a key role in developing the agenda and published several important papers in this area, outlining both why open and transparent science is important, but how we can do better. I'm also joined this morning by Dr. Harry Tattan-Birch. Harry is a research fellow in behavioural science and health, as well as a statistician at UCL. Harry's well versed in pre-registration of protocols and study analysis plans, but importantly, he has become a source of information for how to deal with deviations from these and how we report these. Next slide. So BR UK is committed to open science practices, and this I hope will be just one of a number of webinars on the issue. Today we will be covering how we at BR UK approach open science. We will cover different aspects of open research, some in more depth than others, hence why we need to continue the conversation. We'll discuss the benefits of open research practices, and importantly, because this has come to the fore from our own discussions as a group of researchers and policymakers, which we all have varying experiences of open research practices, we're going to discuss the fears around pre-registration, because it is important to acknowledge that while we may see the benefits of pre-registration and other practices, there are fears around this, such as making ourselves look professionally vulnerable, maybe. So Harry will talk us through changes to protocols, the how, when and why, and we will have a discussion at the end. So there'll be 3 presentations and then we'll have a wider discussion at the end, but do add your questions as they come to mind throughout. Next slide. So just briefly, I want to share why we as a group are committed to this. BR UK is a big investment and we have uniquely brought together researchers across the sciences. So the more we share, the greater the pace others can see, share and replicate our work, and this accelerates the scientific process. We can be more economical with time and resource, and we all know that we need to make that happen. We can hope as well that the more we share, it improves our standards and hopefully those of others if our work is open to scrutiny. And by making as much material available as possible throughout the research process, we think this is an excellent way of engaging wider networks. We're still a fairly new consortium, so initially our approaches are those based on current best practice, but of course we're keen that as we become established and more unique methods for sharing our practices becomes available to us, that we will adopt. So here's a link to our open science strategy, and this can be seen as a living document, open to changes as new evidence on best practice becomes available. Next slide, please. So in our strategy, we have some key commitments. We have an emphasis on open access, including, but not limited to, pre-registration, open code, making our measures available, and open access publication, including non-traditional outputs and preprints. And we're also making use of the open science framework to share these. We seek feedback from a wider network of researchers before we make this public. These are researchers within our group. This, we think, is an important way to share our research plans among our group, to break down silos, but also to get a wider set of perspectives before we sign our outputs off. We aim to share research data in a manner that allows others to access, reuse and build upon it. And if you do build upon ours, please tell us, share this information with us. You can go to our website and we have a page of how you can get in touch. Our software and tools will be made freely available where appropriate and modifiable. Next slide. Lastly, we believe in bringing the public into our work. So we have a range of outputs for key publications, and these will be developed with a view to group level meaning and context, and we will share these too. Importantly, BR UK does not want to work in a silo. So as we develop our practices, we aim to share our learnings, the things that have worked, the things that need improvement. And one way we can do this is by more webinars. So now I'd like to hand over to Marcus to talk us through some of the fundamentals of open research practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Okay. Sancho, can you put up the version of the slides that you've got, because it's not allowing me to share screen, and I think that's a problem at my end.
Just doing that for you, Marcus. Just be a moment.
It's reinstalled Zoom, and the permissions have gone wonky as a result. So it's probably quicker if Sancho can share. It'll be a little bit clunkier, but we'll do it that way. So I'm Marcus Munafo. I'm a psychologist and occasional epidemiologist at the University of Bristol, and I'm also the chair of the UK Reproducibility Network Supervisory Board. So I'm speaking more in that capacity today because, as you'll hear about, the UK Reproducibility Network, and you can see the logo on the bottom left there, is dedicated, amongst other things, to promoting the uptake of open research practices for a range of reasons. I think there are moral reasons to work in a transparent and open way. Most of our research is funded by public money or charitable donations, so making as much of what we do available to as wide an audience as possible, I think, is the right thing to do. There are pragmatic reasons for doing it, which are, for example, that it enables reuse of research objects like data and code by others. And as I'll talk about, I think there are selfish reasons to do it, in that it can improve the quality of the research that we produce and make our workflows ultimately more efficient. Next slide, please. So in terms of those selfish reasons, the aspect that I'm going to focus on today is the fact that there has been growing recognition, I think, over the last 15 years or so, that science is not as self-correcting as we might like it to be. And that is in part because the quality of research that's produced in the first place is lower than it might be. And that's not due to people being bad at what they do or being malicious in any way. It's simply that science research is a human endeavor. People make mistakes, and the consequence of that is that errors creep into papers. And we can all see that when we look at published articles that have been read by multiple authors, read by reviewers and editors, copy edited, proofread, and they still have typos in them. Errors will creep into any human endeavor, and we need to have processes for catching those. Next slide, please. It's also the case that those concerns around the quality of the research that we produce have reached quite a high level. So, for example, last year, the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee produced its report into reproducibility and research integrity. Major funders like UK Research and Innovation have focused on these issues, and it's part of that wider conversation that's happening at the moment around research culture that is reflected in the higher priority that will be given to people, culture, and environment in the next research excellence framework. So there is an awareness that there is more that we could do to improve the quality of the research that we produce, and these discussions have reached the level of funders and policymakers, and I would suggest that that places the onus on us as researchers to do what we can to move things forward in a way that works for us as researchers, rather than waiting for an intervention that is being designed by a politician, for example. And so the argument I'm going to make is that of those reasons that I talked about for working in a transparent way, one is that by being transparent, we can drive up the quality of the research that we produce, and therefore address these issues of reproducibility and the extent to which science self-corrects and self-corrects rapidly enough. Next slide, please. And part of the challenge, and we may want to come back to this when it comes to the question of how and why we incentivize open research practices, is that the way in which we actually work on the ground does not well reflect the true scientific process, if you like. So we know that if we follow the scientific method, there is a self-correction function built into that, which it requires us to do things like publish our null results and to give a full account of everything that we did and to admit when we're wrong. But in reality, because we tend to work in a more closed way, that method has become distorted by the incentive structures that we work within, where we are, for example, incentivized to publish more than we're incentivized to actually be right. We're incentivized to publish noteworthy, eye-catching findings rather than to publish a full and honest account of what we did and found, even if the findings were ostensibly less interesting or exciting than we might have hoped them to be. And all of that acts against, ultimately, not just the quality of the research that we produce, but the speed with which the research that we produce can lead to societal benefit and impact. Next slide, please. Back one, thank you. So this is an example that some of you will be familiar with. It was published a while ago now, and the paper demonstrated two things by collecting real data on real people, and those people were randomized to listen to When I'm 64 by the Beatles or another type of music, and what they found, with a p-value less than 0.05, was that listening to When I'm 64 makes you a year younger. It doesn't make you feel younger, it loses a year of life. You actually reverse the arrow of time. Now, that's clearly a false finding. That can't be true. One thing that the study demonstrated is that if you build enough flexibility into the design, conduct, and analysis of your study, you can very quickly, by running multiple analyses, achieve statistical significance, but that doesn't mean that the finding is correct. And in this case, the finding is clearly false. You can't lose a year of life by listening to music. But this is structurally very similar to any number of other studies that exist in the published literature. So that problem of analytical flexibility is known and is demonstrated quite nicely here. But I think the more important finding that this paper is perhaps less well known for is that having done that, you have a choice. You can either report what you did fully and transparently so that that flexibility in the design, conduct, and analysis of your study is there for the reader to see so that they can interpret that final result in that context, or you can present a redacted, curated version of what you did that is designed to give the most compelling version rather than the most transparent and complete version. And that's shown here. So you have an abstract which gives the full account of all of the flexibility, the number of variables collected, the optional stopping that was used when it came to data collection. And you have embedded within that, in bold, a different abstract that you could write that might be a little bit more convincing because you are glossing over all of that flexibility. And the challenge we have is that when we read an article, for the most part, we have no way of knowing which version we're reading. Are we reading a full account of everything that was done? Or are we reading an account that was written in order to get that paper published in a certain type of journal, to convince the reader so that they cite the work, and so on? And we simply can't tell because we have a model of science that is predicated on trust in individuals, that we rely on people to do the right thing. But we also know that the incentive structures that we work within push against that and push behavior unconsciously, often, in the other direction. And I think as behavioral scientists, we of all people should understand those drivers of behavior and the tension between doing the right thing and what we want to do and what we are incentivized to do or shaped to do. Next slide, please. And we can see what difference transparency makes when we introduce a change. Now, this is a pre-post analysis, so we need to be a little bit careful about our causal inference. But the funder, the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute in the United States in 2000, mandated the registration of primary outcomes on clinicaltrials.gov. So you can see year of publication on the x-axis, and the little flag is when that change was introduced. Before that, the majority of trials that they published that were reported showed a benefit for the intervention over the comparator. Those are shown as little pluses. And some of them were neutral, shown in blue, where there was no evidence of a difference between the intervention and the comparator. But of course, there was no way of knowing whether or not what was reported as the primary outcome before 2000 was in fact the a priori primary outcome, or if it had been a secondary outcome that had been promoted in the write-up to be called the primary outcome on the basis of a small p-value or a larger effect size. After 2000, someone could, in principle, check. They could go to clinicaltrials.gov and go, oh, what they reported in their paper is different to what it was on clinicaltrials.gov, and that would be embarrassing. So after 2000, the vast majority of trials are neutral, a couple are positive, and one for the first time shows evidence of harm. So a dramatic shift in the nature of results that are published following the requirement to be transparent in a way that makes it harder to switch outcomes when writing up the final results of the paper. So I would argue that on the right, we have a more honest account of what science is really like. Most experiments don't work. On the left-hand side, we have what happens when you allow for that redacting and curating and that finessing of results to give the most compelling findings. And of course, one of the problems with that is that early career researchers in particular see the published literature looking pristine because everything works. And their own personal experience is that nothing works because that's how science really is. And unless they're lucky enough to have a mentor who tells them what's really going on, that the problem is with incentives and how we publish, they feel that the problem is their own. I had that experience as a PhD student. I tried to replicate a finding that looked exactly nailed on according to the published literature, and I couldn't replicate that finding. And so I thought that the problem was me, that I wasn't cut out for a career in science. And it was only because I was lucky enough to see a kind of grizzled academic at a conference who said, oh, everyone knows that finding is rubbish. No one can replicate that finding. So that was known. But if you only had the published literature to rely on, then you couldn't find that out. You had to rely on that hidden knowledge that was held by the community. Next slide, please. So that's why we set up the UK Reproducibility Network, which is a network of researchers, grassroots communities of practice on the ground that we call local networks, institutional members that have a senior academic focused on research improvement. And the idea is that the local network lead and the institutional lead work in partnership, one representing the voice of the grassroots community, one holding senior management's feet to the fire. And at UCL, you have David Shanks, for example, as the institutional lead, and Jesse Baldwin is one of the local network leads. And there are 40 universities across the UK now that have an institutional lead. You can find that on our website. And we also have a stakeholder group of funders, publishers, learning societies, and the structure allows for coordination and collaboration within and between those elements. Next slide, please. So what do we do within that network? Well, what we do is focus on the research process. We published this paper a few years ago now, which identifies different threats to the hypothetico-deductive model of scientific discovery. And we identified different organizations, agencies that have levers that they can bring to bear to address some of these threats: journals, funders, institutions. One area where researchers themselves have a great deal of agency is open research, sharing data, code, materials, pre-registering our study plans, and so on. And the reason that we think that is important is that that transparency can serve as a quality control check in a similar way to what I was talking about in the context of those trials funded by the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute. By making our research process transparent, it makes it harder to gloss over any of the messy reality of how we did research or what we found, and it allows others to scrutinize our decisions, our choices, and so on. Next slide, please. And the idea here is that if we can get the research process right, then we should be able to trust the research outputs to look after themselves. And that analogy comes from the manufacturing industry, and in particular, the automobile manufacturing industry. You can read about that in this article that we cite here. The idea came from Roby Blumenstein, who is the CEO of the CHDI Foundation that funds Huntington's research in the US. And his idea was that scientific research at the moment is a bit like the US automobile industry in the 1970s, where there is a focus on productivity, lots of cars rolling off the production line. Quality control happens at the end of the process. A car is built and someone counts the wheels and checks the engine starts. And in the 1970s, cars were badly built. They broke down the whole time. And people on this call, some people may be old enough to remember that. It was a statistician, W. Edwards Deming, who took the concept of quality control in manufacturing processes to the Japanese automobile industry, with the idea being that at each step of the production pipeline, there are checks. And if the error rate goes above a certain threshold, you stop the process, correct the error, and then restart the process. And the result of embedding quality control checks into the manufacturing process meant that the quality of Japanese cars was transformed, and that industry still has a reputation for reliability today. And because every automobile manufacturer adopted that same process, which became known as the Toyota process, you don't see broken down cars nearly as frequently as you did 30 years ago. And it led to a dramatic change in quality of the eventual product by focusing on the process. So the analogy here is that if we can focus our quality control checks, not at the end of the process by reviewing the final manuscript, with no way of checking what happened before, but instead focus our quality control on the process itself, then we can, to some extent, trust that process to generate high quality outputs. Next slide, please. So these are the principles of what became known as the Toyota process. I think they're quite good principles anyway, that we could perhaps take into these wider discussions that are happening around research culture. But the central one that is relevant to this talk, this conversation, to open research, is that the right process will produce the right results. Next slide, please. So to do this well, there are a few things that need to be in place, and this is part of what UKRN is doing through its open research program. We need to have repositories where we can deposit study protocols, data, code. Ideally, those would be curated repositories. So the repository that we have at Bristol is supported by a data team that will check deposits to make sure that the appropriate consent is in place for the level of access that you want to grant for your data. It will not always be appropriate to make data or anything else that we produce fully open. There may need to be some level of restriction in place. So increasingly, instead of open data, for example, people talk about fair data, data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the guiding principle should be that what we produce should be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary, because there may be issues of intellectual property, confidentiality, patient re-identification, but none of that should be a barrier to making what you produce fair. It just may not be open. And we can perhaps talk about the distinction more later on. Next slide, please. We also need to have training. People need to know how to do this, and it can feel intimidating, particularly if you feel like you have to do it all at once. One of the things we're doing through UKRN is running train the trainer courses, where trainers will come together to develop workshops on different aspects of open research practices, and then deliver those workshops back at their host institutions. And again, many universities represented here will hopefully have access to that. And on our website, we have a range of primers that are short 2 or 3 page introductions to a range of different open research practices that allow people to engage with them, starting with whichever element feels easiest for them. Next slide, please. But I've already talked about incentives and how current incentives push us in a different direction to where we might want to go from a moral point of view, if you like. One of the things that we're doing across the UKRN institutions and more generally is looking at how we can create incentives to drive the uptake of open research practices. Bristol has introduced open research practices into its promotion criteria, and that is being extended across other universities within the UK. We have an open research prize to celebrate open research practices and again to provide an incentive. And ideally that would be done in a coordinated way across institutions so that what is good for your career at one institution in terms of engaging with open research practices is also good for your career at the next institution that you move to. Next slide, please. And finally, we need to make sure that the way in which we work is consistent across institutions, so that when you move from UCL to Bristol or vice versa, the way in which we are encouraged to share data, but also the way in which we do share data, for example, is broadly consistent, which is one of the reasons why we've adopted this train the trainer model for our open research training, so that even if the workshops on open research practices that are delivered at individual institutions are tailored to those audiences, they all have some common DNA because they all came from a single train the trainer workshop. Next slide, please. And also, we recognize that open research will look and feel very different across different disciplines. We have some vignettes that describe what open research looks like across a range of different disciplines on the UKRN website, from archaeology and classics all the way through to computer science. And the guiding principle here is that we can make our research process as transparent as possible. And in any research endeavor, choices will be made, decisions will be made, and the source material that we engage with, whatever that might be, whether that be monographs or photographs or data collected through an experimental design, all of that can be made transparent and allow for that interrogation and that scrutiny that can serve as a quality control process. So if you work in a range of different disciplines, or your discipline is not a quantitative one where much of the open research conversation has happened to date, that shouldn't preclude a degree of engagement with open research practices. And what that looks like is captured in these different vignettes. Next slide, please. And what that transparency also allows for is greater internal scrutiny. So one argument is that by working in a more transparent way, by making our study protocols and our data and our code available for others to scrutinize, errors can be detected. And that's definitely something that we found in our own research. So in our research group in Bristol, we've been posting data to the Bristol repository for about 10 years. And a couple of months ago, a master's student from Glasgow emailed me to say, I'm sorry, but I found an error in one of your deposits. When I ran the code against the data, the table that I got was different to the table in the published manuscript. And that could have been embarrassing, but actually it was a useful opportunity to correct an error that had crept into our work. It turned out, fortunately, that the error was a minor one. It was in the data dictionary, not in the data or in the code. So actually the eventual manuscript was correct, but the data dictionary in the deposit had an error in it. So we were able to correct that error, update the deposit, and now that error is no longer in the public domain, it's been corrected. So that external scrutiny does spot errors, but also can serve as an incentive to develop more rigorous internal quality control processes, because a bit like, again, the example of the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute, if you know that someone can check, if you know that someone might spot an error in our data, in our code, in our manuscript, we would much rather that didn't happen than have to correct things after the fact. So we check things 4 or 5 times internally, whereas previously we might have only checked them 2, 3 or 4 times. So we have a pilot here in Bristol that is looking at how we can leverage that open research architecture to conduct more internal quality control checks, again focusing on the research process, in the hope that that will then generate higher quality outputs, and also, for example, make the work that we produce more attractive to external partners, because they can be more confident in the integrity of the process, the data, and the eventual results. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of interest in the moment in people, culture, and environment in the context of the next Research Excellence Framework. And what I would argue is that when we talk about people, culture, and environment, I think the culture word is perhaps unhelpful. We should be focusing more on the environment and the people. And if we focus on the environment, that's where the research process is embedded. And if we can get the right process embedded in our research environment, then the other things that we produce and that are measured through the REF, research outputs and impact, will flow from that because they are downstream of that process. And also, the people that come through the system who learn not only how to do research, but also how to curate their data, share their data, and work in this more transparent way, they will have skills that make them more employable, not just within academia, but beyond. And so that focus on the environment and the research process that can be supported by working in a more transparent way, I think has the potential to have a range of different downstream benefits, not only on research itself, but also on the people who engage in it. And I think that's my last slide, Sancho. There we go. Thank you.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much, Marcus. I'm glad we had you. Can I just ask a question before we go to Harry? And that is the pilot at Bristol. How can we find out more about that?
So that's being led by Fiona Booth, and feel free to drop me a line or find Fiona's email. Fiona comes from the pharmaceutical industry, where they have quality assurance frameworks embedded in how they work. And we're trying to develop a version of that that works for academia. We don't want to just parachute in something that's been designed for a different sector, but we can learn from other sectors, I think. So I talked about manufacturing. There's also learning from the pharmaceutical industry. I think one of the things that academia can do is both learn from other sectors, but also apply its own research methods to itself to see whether or not differences in ways of working actually do improve things in the way that we hypothesize effectively. I have postulated that open research practices drive up quality, but that's an empirical question. We need to test it ultimately.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so great to hear you use your own example of where there's been an error and actually you've been able to detect it and make it better. So thanks so much. So now we're
sorry, Sharon, and I would say notably by a master's student. I mean, we need to get away from the idea that the more senior you are, the more likely you are to be able to spot stuff. I thought that was really interesting because she came at it with a completely fresh set of eyes.
Yeah, Yeah, well, yeah, I think I'm making a few more errors the busier I get, actually. So yeah, great. Now we'll hand over to Harry to talk about pre-registration and deviations. And in the interest of transparency, I want to say that this has been a conversation that we've been having quite a lot as a network around how do we deal with these, how do we report them? So really glad that Harry can join us.
Thanks, Sharon. Just show the slides. Right, I hope you can see that okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about pre-registration and the fears people have around it. A lot of the time, the fears are around what happens if you spot a mistake when you've pre-registered your plan, you collect the data, you run the analysis, and you realize there's some mistakes in that plan. Does that sort of completely invalidate your study? And I'd like to sort of quell some of those fears and clarify that. There we go. So I'm going to start with one of those horrifying figures I've ever seen. So this is the distribution of 1 million Z values from Medline. And what you can see is surrounding those orange lines, which show the conventional significance cutoffs, there's this pile up of results on either side of the cutoff. And then this massive gap of essentially missing studies in the middle, which just shows the huge publication bias in the literature. And this is because of a few things. So there's journal gatekeeping, where some journals obviously used to at least require significant results to be published. And nowadays, some just prefer significant results. People have their own commitment to theories, which means they want to find certain results. And so both these things lead to what's called forking paths, where people make certain analysis decisions after seeing their data to lead them to get the certain result that they're interested in. And then there's also the file draw problem, where people might run a study, get a result that they weren't expecting or they think won't be published. So then they just don't bother writing it up and putting it into the public domain. So that's like a fundamental lack of transparency that Marcus has been talking about is so important. I'd also like to note that it's often talked about the pressure to find significant results, so p less than 0.05, but sometimes there are pressures to do the opposite. And if you zoomed in on this graph here, you'd actually see there's a pileup of p-values just above 0.05, where people potentially reverse p-hacking their results to find a non-significant difference. So an example of where someone might be motivated to do that, as Sander Greener notes, is drug companies who might be motivated to avoid finding significant differences in the rate of side effects and adverse events linked to their drugs. And pre-registration is a potential cure for this. And Marcus has already discussed these results, but I'll just recap them. So this is before and after primary outcomes were required on clinicaltrials.gov, and you see the amount of significant benefits of the drug found was 57% before pre-registration was required, and this dropped to 8% afterwards, which, as Marcus says, I think is a much more accurate representation of the true underlying distribution of results. But people have fears about pre-registration. I think these are partially justified, and I'm just going to discuss them and how we can combat them. So the first is, does it stifle scientific creativity? So people will note that many of the most important scientific findings throughout history arose from serendipity and exploration rather than hypotheses that were planned a priori. The classic example being penicillin. And people might fear that too much focus on pre-registered plans might lead to tunnel vision, where people then miss these serendipitous observations and don't look in detail and explore their data. And there was an interesting study by Yanai and Lercher in 2020 that sort of looked at this. They gave a group of students a data set which has step counts and BMI as the two core variables. And they asked half of them to take a hypothesis-driven approach, where they asked them specifically to look and answer 3 research hypotheses. And they asked the other half to take a hypothesis-free approach, where they just simply asked them, what do you conclude from this data? And what they should conclude from the data is that the data were essentially meaningless, created by the researchers to fool them. Because if they did the most basic of exploratory data analysis approaches, where they plotted step count on the x-axis and BMI on the y-axis, they would have spotted the hidden monkey in the data set. And what they found was that the 26% of the hypothesis-driven group found the monkey, whereas 64% of the hypothesis-free group found the monkey. So this does lend some support to the idea that potentially having this pre-registered hypothesis might lead to tunnel vision. But I think the true important thing to take from this study is that a good quote from Gelman covers this. We should be treating pre-registration as a flaw, not a ceiling. It's a list of things that you plan to do, that's all. Pre-registration doesn't stop you from doing more. And I actually think it's important in all studies to have an exploratory data analysis approach, because sometimes you'll spot interesting findings or potentially fundamental issues as a result of that exploration that are really important to publish. Another fear is, does it prevent us from fixing flaws? So if we have a pre-registered plan of the exact analysis we're going to take, what happens when we realize, almost inevitably in most studies, I'd say, during or after data collection, that there's a flaw in the planned analysis or a flaw in the planned data collection approach? Are we forced to stick with these planned analyses despite these issues? And some of the issues that might arise during data collection are, you might spot a severe issue with the intervention or the experimental manipulation. That means you have to end the study. You may need to add checks for bots or for attention checks on online platforms. You might realize that an outcome was inappropriate when you're conducting the study, because it might not be pragmatic, or there might be other issues. You might run out of money. That's a common thing in randomized controlled trials, where the money runs out before the target sample size is recruited. And then during analysis, a number of other issues might arise. Your model might simply fail to converge, which means you can't actually present the planned analysis that you intended to. There might be issues with a variable that's incorrectly measured, or there might be unexpected messiness. And then finally, you might spot that the important assumptions underlying your planned model are actually violated. And in any of these cases, you might want to change your analysis or perform other analyses to investigate this. Another place where flaws can be spotted is during peer review. And Barron notes some issues he's seen about the way people are using their pre-registered plan as a justification to avoid fixing errors. So what he says is, as an editor, I find that pre-registration does in fact cause problems sometimes. In some cases, the pre-registered plan for data analysis is, well, incorrect, but the authors want to include it in the paper anyway because it's what they said they would do. In other cases, authors simply resist suggestions or requests to report a different analysis. And I've actually experienced this myself when I've spotted issues with analysis as a peer reviewer, and authors have sort of pushed back on investigating that issue because they say, well, we pre-registered the analysis, so there's nothing we can do now. And that's actually a misinterpretation of the point of pre-registration, as I'll come back to. So does it stifle scientific creativity? I don't think it does, not inherently. Pre-registration simply makes it transparent what was planned before seeing the data and which decisions were data dependent. And to avoid the tunnel vision that might arise by having a specified plan, I think it's important to include an exploration phase, because exploration is important, but we need to make clear that that's what it is. There's a nice distinction that Jacob makes between day science and night science, where day science is your kind of confirmatory hypothesis testing approach, and night science is more exploratory hypothesis generating, or trying to pick apart issues in your confirmatory tests. The issue is when previously in a lot of the literature, people are doing night science, they're exploring lots of different analyses, but then they're reporting it as if it was a pre-planned hypothesis and they only tested one analysis, say. So it's night science masquerading as day science. And the other issue, does it prevent us from fixing flaws? And I don't think it does. It shouldn't anyway. Please don't use pre-registration as an excuse to avoid valid reviewer and editor suggestions. If you spot a clear error, it is reasonable to change your plan to account for this. What matters really is just that the changes are reported transparently and explained. It's all about transparency. There's some empirical results from Clayson in 2021, where they looked at pre-registered articles in psychological science. And they found 3 really important things that I think it's important to bear in mind. First is that deviations from protocol are commonplace. In fact, they found it in 93% of articles had at least one change from their protocol. So I think people shouldn't be scared about doing pre-registration because they think, oh no, we might have to change the plan afterwards. This is completely normal. What's important is that you just report what changes were made. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, deviations were not disclosed. In fact, only 4% of the articles reported all of the changes from protocol in the final article. And even when they were reported, sometimes they were not fully explained. So when a change is made, it's important to give a reason why the change is made, so that the reader doesn't think you've just essentially hacked your results to get a certain conclusion. So an example of where this is done, well, they said participants who answered the manipulation check incorrectly were excluded from the analysis as specified in our pre-registered exclusion criteria. And then they say 4 additional participants clearly did not follow task instructions as they reported outcomes higher than 6 or more in 50% of trials. They too were excluded. So here they've been transparent about what was pre-registered and what was not, and the change that was made, and they've explained that change. And then I think it's always good practice, wherever possible, to also report the result from the pre-registered plan. So here they've said, including the 4 participants whose exclusion was not based on our pre-registered exclusion criteria, did not change any of the results reported here. So including this means, again, that readers, reviewers will be less suspicious that you're trying to hide something from them. And of course, it just makes everything more transparent. So the core takeaways from this talk are, I think we should be thinking of pre-registration as a floor, not a ceiling. It's the plan of the main things we're going to do. It doesn't stop you from doing other analyses. Importantly, it's not an excuse to avoid carefully inspecting your data and exploring different parts of it. And it's definitely not an excuse for fixing flaws in the analysis. And the second thing to keep in mind is that deviations from protocol are normal and you shouldn't necessarily be scared of them. But when those deviations do almost inevitably occur, just be transparent. So report what you've changed, what was planned beforehand and what was not. Provide an explanation for the change. And then wherever possible, show the results from the planned analysis so that people can compare the pre-registered and the updated analysis. And that's all from me. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Harry. Excellent overview there. I'm going to open up to questions now. We've had a few, but do keep typing questions in. One of the questions I think we should come to first, because we have described these procedures mainly based on quantitative data. So it's really important, I think, to think about, is this applicable, or, you know, is this transferable to qualitative data? And what are some of the ways that we can you know, be more transparent with qualitative data while at the same time still respecting people's anonymity, which is something that I often hear qualitative researchers say. So do either of you want to start by answering that?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first on that, and then Harry may have something to add. I mean, first of all, exactly what open research or open scholarship looks like will be slightly different across disciplines. Secondly, and there's a related question in the chat that I could maybe capture at the same time. I said that we should try to make our work as open as possible, but as close as necessary, exactly because there will be times when there is a risk of re-identification or to anonymity. It partly depends on the infrastructure that we have. So Bristol's repository has 3 levels of access. You can make what you deposit open, but you can also make it restricted, where you have to request access and demonstrate that you're a bona fide researcher, and also a level of controlled access, where your request goes to a data access committee and the data are only shared under the terms of a data transfer agreement for the most sensitive data. So in those conditions, you can make qualitative data available. We've done that in our own research, and I can put some examples of that into the chat if that's helpful. And what we've done is, first of all, make it clear during the consenting process what we will do with the data so that participants are comfortable with that. Then obviously anonymize the data as much as possible, but if there is still a risk of re-identification, for example, chosen one of the more restrictive levels of access rather than simply making it open. And that also is made easier by the fact that we have a data team that can advise us on that point about as open as possible, as close as necessary. And that's the other question that's in the chat. Who makes that judgment? Researchers make the initial judgment, but it's really helpful to have an independent data team who are experts in this stuff, who can do that with you. And although we've been sharing our data for about 10 years, we still send deposits to the Bristol repository that are sent back to us because we have inadvertently included a potentially re-identifying variable in our data set, for example. So it's important to have professionals for whom this is their day job working with us to make sure that we do this well.
Excellent.
And what I would say finally, actually, is that when it comes to qualitative research, remember, this is not about one discipline telling other disciplines how to work. It's about learning from each other. So part of the transparency that exists in qualitative research is around positionality and positionality statements, where there is a much deeper understanding of the lens that we bring to interpreting our own results. And that applies just as strongly to quantitative research. There's plenty of evidence that quantitative researchers interpret their data through a particular lens. And if you give the same data to 2 different groups of people, you get different interpretations. But quantitative researchers don't understand that as well as qualitative researchers do. So this is about learning best practice across disciplines, I think.
Yeah. And also, just to add to that, I do a bit of qualitative research, not lots, but what we're talking about data here, but actually part of open science practices is about materials. You can make your topic guides, you can make your measures open access too, so that if somebody else is considering running a study with a similar population, if you've already developed a topic guide in a certain area, that can be really good to share, to have on the open science framework. It's about making sure that we're not also wasting time, and we might get greater replication in even qualitative pieces of work if we're asking similar questions but to different populations. So I think it's important that we're not just focusing on data, but actually materials across the research project. I just want to move on, Harry. There's a question here that you could maybe answer, and it's sort of linked as well. But in terms of transparency, journals often have restrictive word counts. How can we share everything when we're pressured to be concise as we can?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it can be really annoying. But what's great nowadays is you can have an online repository where you include any additional information and then link to it from the manuscript. So what we do in our group is we tend to set up an open science a page on the open science framework where we'll put our pre-registrations, we'll put our data, our analysis code, and then any additional information about the study that we couldn't fit into the 3,000 words of the journal. So that might be more information about the methods, about the measures used. So the best place is just to include that somewhere, so that someone, and link to it from your article, so that someone can access it if they need to.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, I have a question. Maybe both of you can come in on this. So this is something that I've heard as well when I'm talking to people about open science and trying to convince them of the benefits. My experience of depositing to a repository is that it's time consuming, lots of new things to think about, and support from a dedicated curation team was really helpful and reassuring, especially when coming to data sharing agreements. But that links to a broader point. Also, some people think, I'm really busy already. How do I find the time to do this? And how do we convince people who are on fixed term contracts, and going to Marcus's brilliant point about people who are incentivized to publish rather than incentivized, to necessarily always do a good job, but you said it was in other words. But I guess, so how do we convince people that it's worth taking the time and actually it might save time?
So can I answer that, Sharon? Or
Yeah, sure.
There's a great quote by Florian Markowitz. It may not be his quote, but he used it in a paper that he wrote, 5 Selfish Reasons to Work Reproducibly. He's a cancer biologist at Cambridge. And he said, the most important collaborator you have is yourself 6 months ago, and that person doesn't answer emails. And the point here is that many open research practices are really just about good practice, curating your data so that other people can use them by making sure that variables are well named, that you have a data dictionary, that you have corresponding metadata. It doesn't just mean that other people can use your data. It means that you yourself, when you go back to your data set 6 months later or 6 years later, can make sense of it. When you onboard a new researcher and they want to understand how you did a previous study, they can understand it much more quickly. So these ways of working ultimately benefit us, I think, and create efficiencies. It's true that we have to get out of a current way of working and over the hill to a new way of working, where things will be more efficient. So we need to put in some initial effort. But I would argue that effort pays back very quickly, because you are able to then make sense of your own data much more quickly when you go back to them. And I have colleagues who have labeled their variables badly, who go back to their data because a revision comes back on a manuscript and they can't make sense of it because they didn't have a good process for curating their data internally. So I think there are selfish reasons to work in these ways that benefit us ultimately. It is true that we need to get out of that local minimum, but there are some other benefits directly, particularly to early career researchers, I think. And I think those fall into 2 categories. One is that each of these things that we produce, these intermediate research objects, our pre-registration, our data, our code, we can put onto repositories. They're assigned a digital object identifier. They are literally publications. And you can have sections on your CV for pre-registrations, study protocols, data sets, code, and so on, that allows for more granular recognition of who did what, but also allows you as an early career researcher to demonstrate that you got stuff done. And one of the reasons we focus on publications as PIs recruiting postdocs, for example, is that we want to see that people can get stuff done. And actually, there are now far more ways in which you can demonstrate that by evidencing those intermediate steps. It's also true that because funders are increasingly mandating this, research groups are having to get on board with the open research agenda. And the quickest way to get your research group up to speed is to recruit, a young postdoc who knows how to do these things, who can show everyone else how to do it. So I think by working in these ways, you make yourself more employable. And I think that's increasingly true, because more and more research groups want people who can do this stuff.
Excellent. Harry, did you have anything to add to that? Next question?
No.
No? Okay. Well, I'll come to you for this next question, actually, Harry. How would you define the in pre-registration, for example, before the study begins or before analysis of collected data begins?
That's a great point. And I think it depends on the specific type of data or type of study you're doing. Usually when it comes to like randomized trials, you would pre-register before collecting the data. But you might also then pre-register a more specific analysis plan afterwards, but before seeing your data. But yeah, sometimes if it's an existing survey, say, or an existing data set, the idea is to pre-register your protocol before analyzing the data. Or before viewing the data. It's just so that you're not making decisions dependent on the specific nuances of the data set you have, actually, leading you to try and get certain results.
And I just add, this is not about a rigid set of rules that we all need to follow. It's about a framework or a way of working that prioritizes transparency, and to an extent downstream of that sharing, in a way that protects us against ourselves, protects us from our own kind of cognitive biases, our own enthusiasm, our own desire to find something, so that we just ultimately produce high quality research and get to the right answer, if we ever can, more rapidly. So it's not prescriptive, it's meant to just be a framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course you can update your protocols, and you can highlight where they're updated and provide an explanation of why. So another question for you, Harry, but actually this is going to come into a broader point, which Marcus, if you can touch on too. So thanks for an interesting talk, Harry. As an early career researcher, how can we get our more senior colleagues and collaborators on board with open science practices? It undoubtedly requires more of their time to do intermittent checks rather than just checking the final manuscript, which may not be a priority of theirs. So, Harry, you're relatively a career researcher. So could you, shed some light on this?
Yeah, I guess I've been lucky with my senior researchers pushing to do open science practices, but other people might not have the same luck. And I would just slightly push back on the point that it undoubtedly requires more of their time, because I think sometimes it can be easier for a more senior colleague to see a protocol beforehand, to know what the student or the early career researcher is planning to do, and then they can suggest changes at that phase before they've already got the final manuscript, and then spot, oh no, there's a fundamental misunderstanding or issue with the plan, that if they had seen the plan beforehand, they would have told them to do something different. So I think it can actually save time and save the early career researcher from having to go back and forth, making changes to their analyses.
Yeah. But also with your protocol, your paper's partly written, except the results and the discussion. So you've agreed upon the background, the rationale, the research questions, the analysis plan. Yeah, like you say, it saves time. I'm pretty sure that my PhD supervisors would have loved me to write some protocols for my studies because they were dense experimental pieces of work that, things come out as you look at the data. So Marcus, anything to add to that on terms of the environment really, and getting people at all stages of their career on board with this?
Well, I mean, first of all, depending on how disruptive you want to be, early career researchers have a lot of power over PIs that they may not appreciate, because of course, if you decided to work in a particular way, there isn't necessarily much that the PI could do about it, and they need those researchers to deliver on their grants, to generate papers and so on. So don't feel like you are a sort of a passive agent in this. I think you have agency, and you can go and say, we want to work in a particular way for the following reasons that we think will benefit all of us in a variety of ways. There may be some concerns, but often in my experience, those concerns are based on misunderstandings around, for example, the point I was making about openness. You don't need to necessarily make everything fully open. If there's anything that you want to protect for a while, most platforms allow for an embargo period so that you can post it, like your pre-registration, for example, but keep that embargoed for a year or 2 years until you're able to protect the IP, or in some cases, because you don't want participants who could be taking place in the study to read about what the study's about, so that they could then, respond in a particular way. So there are all sorts of reasons for wanting to be cautious about different aspects of open research, and most of the concerns that are raised can be addressed, I think. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so just final thoughts from both of you, and then we'll draw the webinar to a close. Is there anything, you want to close on, take away comments? One practice, if people could change one practice. Well, I think my advice would be just to start somewhere. It can feel like a lot because you've got pre-registration, you've got data sharing, you've got code sharing, and so on. But just take one aspect of open research and make a start. Don't feel like there's a complicated set of rules that you need to follow, but rather just do what you can in that context. So post a preprint, post a pre-registration, learn from that, do the next one better. And I think then you will begin to embed that principle of transparency in how you work, and hopefully start to see the benefits of it. I think there are always and remember, it's an evolving landscape, so there are always going to be things to learn, not least because how we do these things and how we do these things well will change. There's a question about, or more of a comment about how there's a growing awareness of how useful it can be to cite the data and the code and the pre-registration in the eventual manuscript, so that you can go out into the different elements of the research process when you're reading that final thing. This is a fast-moving field, but make a start, even if it's a small start, and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could give anyone advice, it's that since I've joined the research group that I'm in now, my protocols get read by not just the co-authors, and the feedback that you get from that is just pretty brilliant, because there are people coming at it from different angles who can spot things. Sometimes it's good for people to look at your protocols with fresh eyes rather than the people that are embedded necessarily within that study. Anything from you, Harry, before we close?
No, I think you both summarised it very well.
Okay, great. So just a couple of things before we close. We are, as part of our work packages, we are running a survey. It's a capability and scoping study where we are looking at what type of behavioural research, human behavioural research, is going on in the UK. So we are planning to be able to present back what is going on with behavioural research in the UK, where's it happening, what's happening. So if you engage with or work with any form of research about human behaviour, please take part in our survey. It takes about 20 minutes. So thank you. And then lastly, next slide. We have another webinar on the 24th of May at 11 a.m. using behavioural theory to inform quantitative models for policy decision makers, with excellent speakers, Professors Jamie Brown, Robin Perhouse, Dr. Hazel Squires and Robert West. And you can register again if you use the code there. There'll also be details on our Twitter account. I still call it Twitter. I know it's X, but anyway, that's at behavioureres_UK. And just lastly, thank you to our collaborators and a huge thanks to our funders. And thank you all for joining us.